Let's get straight to it, Tim, because I've wanted to ask you all day what your reaction has been to the release of the Carter report. You're a passionate Tasmanian. What does it all mean?
I don't really know, Mick. I don't think it actually enhances Tasmania's prospects. And I say that because I believe so strongly that there is only one model that's right for a heartland football state. Their Premier has spoken about this today, and we'll hear from him in just a moment. And I feel as though the report suggests that the preferable ways of going are either via a relocation or via what Colin Carter calls a joint venture with a sort of a fly-in, fly-out team based in Victoria that wears a Tasmanian jumper when it's playing games in Tasmania. And to me, and Colin Carter is with us and we'll ask him about it in just a moment, that brings to my mind the sound of Don Scott tearing that strip off the Melbourne jumper and saying, what are you left with? A Velcro hawk. And I think it smacks of a Velcro map of Tasmania. But we'll ask Colin Carter very shortly. Let's hear firstly from the Tasmanian Premier, Peter Gutwein, after he had digested the report.
The AFL, as I've said, have tried to kick the can down the road. I was clear and unequivocal in terms of the reaction that the state will take if that were to occur. And so we will not finalise those contracts. We will not roll them over with Hawthorn or North Melbourne until we have a clear pathway from the AFL, the starting point of which is a decision by them towards the end of this year as to whether or not we can have our own team.
Peter Gutwein, the Tasmanian Premier, speaking in Hobart today. Colin Carter, the author of this report into Tasmania and its AFL prospects, joins us online. Former VFL-AFL Commissioner, former President of the Geelong Football Club. Colin, thanks for joining us. Could any person, any reasonable person, be surprised at Peter Gutwein's response today?
Well, I think they could be, and I should say that thanks for having me here with you tonight, guys. I'm a Peter Gutwein fan, and I understand his passion, and he actually used my words in my report to say that this was not kicking the can down the road. Kicking the can down the road would be taking the issue off the agenda for another 5 or 10 years and saying, we'll look at it again then. That's absolutely not what happened here. What's come out of this report is, I think, a commitment to go to the clubs with a proposal to make sure there is a team based in Tasmania. And the model of that is still to be resolved, but it's the can hasn't been kicked down the road in the slightest.
Can I just ask you, the report begins with some words of yours to Richard Goyder, the chairman, and Gillan McLaughlin, the CEO, and you say within that the case against Tasmania argues that the club will be a financial drain and that in any case Tasmanians are losing interest. I have to say I found those last 4 words right at the front of your report a gross distortion of reality. Where did that come from?
Well, Tim, I think you have to accept that a lot of people have been opposed to the idea of Tasmania, and that is the nub of the issue. It seems to me that if I had just simply prepared a report which dealt with and endorsed the arguments that people who are pro-Tasmania make, then it would have had no credibility. What I've done is dismantle, one by one, all the arguments against even a 19th licence. The report very clearly takes dozens of arguments made against it, dispatches them and says a 19th licence is at a minimum what should go ahead. And you can say there are any number of people who said to me that people are losing interest down there and you won't get enough support.
Which people were they?
Well, they're some of the people I spoke to. I'm surprised, I'm astonished, actually, that I heard a couple of people on Talkback Radio today. I don't think there are many of them.
But you can't take notice of just isolated voices like that. I mean, this is about something much bigger than that, surely.
Well, Tim, why do you think there hasn't been a team now for the last 50 years?
Because the AFL hasn't had the will to do it.
No, there have been a lot of arguments against it, and you're welcome to have a view which says that none of those arguments against should have ever been listened to, let alone dealt with. I'm surprised that, given the fact I've come out with a clear endorsement for a team in Tasmania, even if something better isn't established, a 19th team, that you're attacking the messenger. I find that a bit extraordinary.
Well, I find and found reading the report that it seems to me that your options in order of preference are a relocation and a joint venture equal first, and a true Tasmanian team, a 19th team in the competition, third. Would that be fair to say?
I think it's fair to say that I firmly believe that the 19th team would be one of the smaller, less financially secure teams in our competition. I absolutely believe they've got a right to be there because they will not be our smallest team or the most vulnerable. But that's the position that I think they'll have. And I'm simply making the case that if you want to talk about a team which is going to be at least in the middle ranks of the AFL wealth ladder, it has to have a slice of the Melbourne market as well, which means that you should at least consider that. Now, if people don't want to consider it, and by the way, the decision will be made by club boards and by their members, and so the AFL can't force this down anybody's throat. So in that sense, I'm not quite sure why you're so worried, but it seems to me to be pretty logical that if the team's going to be one of the smaller ones, one at least ought to point out ways in which it could strengthen its position.
But what you've just said smacks of the mentality of the early commissions, of which you were a part, when they entertained and actually worked towards mergers. And Graham Samuel, when he stepped down from the commission some years later, said to me that if we'd gone that route, the one that he once recommended with 6 clubs entering 3 mergers, we would have torn the heart out of the competition. He had reconsidered all of this. And yet it seems to me that in preferring these kind of artificial means of setting up a team for a heartland state, you are venturing back into that kind of territory where business is more important than having a heart and soul football club. And I'm not being stupid about this. I don't imagine that you can have a team without having a reasonable business model. But there has been a task force which has come up with what I'd have thought was a reasonably reasonable business model, and yet we're still kind of tilting towards the idea of something which diminishes the idea of a heart and soul club.
Well, Tim, I don't agree with what you've said, but I obviously won't be convincing you. I think the business case that I was asked to look at contained a couple of elements. I think it was a good business case, but it included a couple of elements. For example, that the additional TV revenues would more than offset the distribution, which of course makes it closer to a slam dunk. But that was not accepted by a number of people.
But how come the average amount of money derived per club under the current rights agreement of 17 million is brought down to 4 million for Tasmania?
Tim, you didn't let me finish my sentence then, but that's a judgment, and in fact, what I think I did, which was good, I've managed to establish that even if that assumption doesn't hold true, the case for the team still stacks up. I'm astonished that you can't see that. I mean, if all I'd done is accept the assumptions that have been put up and said, yeah, they're all right, people who don't accept those assumptions would therefore say that we've wasted our time. What I've done is establish a good case for saying even if that assumption does not hold up, the case for a Tasmanian team is valid.
Colin,
Can't you see that?
Colin, one of these 3 models that you discuss is the joint venture. I'd like you to expand on how this joint venture would work and draw you to one of the paragraphs in your report where you say at the end of, say, 10 years, an appropriately chosen panel will assess where the bulk of the club support sits in Melbourne or Tasmania, and that will define the future residency of that club. What does that second part mean, and how would a joint venture work?
Well, I think you're asking me to. I was trying to speculate because on what might possibly work, whether it's feasible and whether club members and boards would find that attractive is another matter. It would seem to me that ventures like that are only plausible if one takes a really long term view of where you would like to see your club position in 20 or 50 years' time. Because one of the arguments I've made in the report is that the chances of, even through hard work, changing one's competitive position in a sporting position is pretty low. And so I guess that what that tries to lay out is whether there's a pathway where a club could, not sure where it was going to finish up, experiment. And by the way, that club would be jointly owned by Tasmanian interests. And it would seem to me to be only fair if at the end of a period of time, and by the way, some people in Tasmania said, why don't you give us a 10-year licence just to prove we can do it? At some point, whether it's 10 years, 5 years or 15 years, a decision would have to be made whether the location of the club should be changed. I'm not arguing that that's a model which is attractive to existing clubs. I'm not even arguing that it's highly feasible, but in trying to articulate a future for a club which would make it strong, that's what I've put up.
So what is the timeline? I haven't been able to read your report, Colin, but the timeline of this and the most likely and outcome to be able to happen. Like, what's the easiest model? Like, I'm with Tim. I think the 19th would be brilliant. That's the model I want as well. I don't really like the sound of the others, and I'm not sure how St Kilda and North Melbourne and these clubs would be feeling either about the other options. But what's the most viable option, and also the timeline of this, Colin?
And just on that point, I think that the chances of those other options getting up are obviously not high, and so it's been very important to me to establish that a 19th team is a valid way forward. If I hadn't done that, I think your guys' frustration would be quite reasonable. But as far as the timeline is concerned, I guess I push back on the notion that the decision has to be made now. I mean, first of all, if the clubs have to make the decision, and I would guess, although I can't prove this, I would guess if the clubs were asked to make the decision now, they'd say no. And I can't see any point in asking them to say no and then trying to walk them back from that in the future. And I wouldn't expect them to say yes. They don't know all the details, whether it's drafting rules, how much money the AFL is going to be putting in, how much the Tasmanian government's going to put in, what's going to be provided in way of facilities. Can you seriously expect the clubs to make an informed decision based on what's been presented to them? What's been presented to them is a position in principle that there will be a Tasmanian team. And so whether this takes 6 months or 12 months to sort through, I don't think that's material when you're looking at a 100-year project. And I remind you all that the task force, the Tasmanian government's task force, written in 2019, talked about a team entering the competition in 2025. And so we've got a couple of years to get this right. And it's also just realistic to know that in the current COVID situation where the clubs are losing their shirts, I was talking to one club the other day, and the absence of crowds this weekend is going to cost them over $1 million. Asking them for a decision now would be pure folly and doesn't help the cause at all.
And ultimately, Colin, there is a widely held view that if the AFL wants something badly enough, even if it has to go through the clubs, it will get it. Can it on this?
I believe so. And I've been asked that question several times, and I've said that I can't think of an example when the AFL has laid out and taken the clubs with them on what they think is a really important issue of principle, that we've failed to get there. I know that 2/3 majority is quite big, but and that's one of the reasons why I think pushing for a decision now would be really foolish. I would be very confident if we could take some time over this, whether it's 6 months or 12 months, we will get there. And at the minimum, it'll be a 19th licence, and the others will only get up if the club boards and members actually support it. And so if you guys are right in your estimate of the way the clubs will react, then that's not going to take a lot of time.
Colin, a growing number of club presidents, Andrew Pridham, Peggy O'Neill, Jeff Kennett, to name a few, have called for an independent review into the AFL's governance structure and operations, similar to the Crawford Review of 1993, which you'd remember. Until a few months ago, you were a club president. Do you agree with that view?
I'm in the school that there's constant need for review, and I have no problem at all with the review. I'm less sure that an omnibus review of the AFL is the right way to go, because there are such disparate issues ranging from governance structures, relationship of clubs to the AFL, through to what happens on the field and whether the game's attractive and the whole changing media landscape. I'd probably be in the camp which says, let's see if we can agree amongst the football's leaders what are the half a dozen big issues to be worked through, and whether they're done collectively or in separate projects, I think is less clear to me. I suspect that some of them would need to be done separately.
Colin, I'm encouraged to hear you use the royal we in relation to the push for Tasmania a moment ago. Can I just, in conclusion, put to you, by way of explanation for the strength of my feelings about this, that I'm assured that having pushed for the development of AFLW, that when Geelong weren't included at the outset, you were livid and you were kept waiting for a couple of years. I hope you understand how Tasmanians feel after waiting for a couple of decades and more.
I do, Tim, and I'm disappointed that having read my report that you don't see me as solidly in your camp. And perhaps I'm hoping that the difference between us is simply I have a slightly different view to you about the way to get home on this and get through the various obstacles.
Well, you've put down pegs on 3 different campsites. I can only see one that is suitable for the green jumper. But thank you for your efforts and thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Colin Carter.